they established a stable living situation. Both were dedicated to Serena and to each other. Direct observation in the home showed that Jessica was consistently responsive to Serena, providing her with appropriate stimulation and gentle care that allowed her to thrive. By the end of the first year, Serena was a confident, happy baby who eagerly explored her surroundings, secure in her relationships with her caregivers. In stark contrast, Thomas's mother, Veronica, had run away from an abusive home when she was 12 years old and had little further contact with her family. When Thomas was born, Veronica's mother told her that it was her problem and made it completely clear that there would be no help from her. Veronica had serious drug and alcohol problems and was mistreated by her on-again, off-again drug-dealing partner, the likely father of Thomas. Even after the baby was born, they moved from place to place, living with a parade of transient housemates. 4A. Time, when Veronica's partner was in jail, she and Thomas lived in a shelter. At the end of Thomas's first year, they were living with Veronica sister and her boyfriend, in another chaotic household. Direct observation showed Veronica to be notably unresponsive to Thomas, especially when she was feeling depressed, which occurred frequently. At times, she also was harshly rejecting, angrily rebuffing Thomas when he wanted contact. Not surprisingly, the relationship between Thomas and Veronica was not a good one. Thomas showed little confidence in Veronica's availability. When assessed in a standard laboratory situation involving moderate stress, Thomas explicitly would not go to Veronica for comfort. His emotions were generally flat, and his explorations superficial. These differences in the first year of life are dramatic, even though these children are growing up in broadly the same culture and the same community. But how important are these differences? How lasting is their impact? How easily modified are they? What are the processes that govern continuity and change from the early to the later years of childhood? Most importantly, if there is a lasting influence of early experiences, how and why does this happen? What is the developmental process through which early experience has its effect on later life? The idea that early experience plays a critical role in the development of the person is one of the oldest hypotheses in all of psychology. Freud and other early pioneers in psychology, such as James Mark Baldwin, argued that nothing is more important for the development of children than the way they are treated by their parents or others who care for them. Even before the rise of formal psychology, psychologically minded essayists and poets had espoused this idea. Alexander Pope, 1731–1961, page 149, wrote, "As the twig is bent, the tree's inclined, I'm." 8. Understanding development. Implying that the mature form is forecast at the very beginning. William Wordsworth, 1807–1940, page 3, captured the same idea with his famous line, "The child is father of the man." Indeed, what could be more plausible than the idea that one's expectations and beliefs about self and others should be based on past experience? Yet this seemingly straightforward notion has proven to be deceptively complex and challenging to evaluate scientifically. At times, studies have failed to find confirming evidence. At other times, apparent confirmations have been put forward, only to be criticized on methodological grounds. The result is that many prominent psychologists have remained skeptical regarding this basic proposition. Kagan, 1984, Lewis, 1998. While recent work on how experience affects the developing brain has spurred new confidence in the validity of this hypothesis, definitive work with humans is only just emerging. Nelson, DeHaan, and Thomas, in Press, Shore, 2002. Why has this task proven to be so difficult? On the one hand, fail. Years of the hypothesis are very easy to produce. Properly measuring early experience is itself challenging. Where does one even begin? Some things, of course, like level of poverty, are easy to measure. But level of poverty often tends to be a relatively stable variable, influencing a child not just early in life but in an ongoing way. Thus, consistency in development could simply be due to continued poverty. Moreover, it is not really a measure of experience. Many parents living in poverty provide excellent care for their children. Poverty simply stands for a host of correlative challenges that some families face. Ferguson, Swain Campbell, and Horwood, 2004. Quality of care and other experiential measures, on the other hand, are difficult to define and measure. What is the essence of positive early experience anyway? Likewise, proper outcome measures are equally difficult to achieve. How does one know a person is developing well? Does this not change from age to age? And even if we can agree on definition, adequate measurement remains a challenge. Constructs such as high self-esteem, adequate emotional regulation, and even competence with peers are difficult to capture. With either poor early measures or poor outcome measures, the study is doomed to failure. Just as many problems arise when a study does find that an early experience measure predicts an outcome of interest. How can we know that the early measure is not simply predictive because it is related to some other early condition, such as poverty or stress, that exerts an ongoing effect, or because the early quality itself continues to exist at the later time? Children may be doing well because of supports their parents are providing at the later age, which happen to also be reminiscent of the manner in which parents treated them in the early years. Or perhaps the challenge 9. Some inherent characteristic, or set of characteristics, of the child elicited the positive parenting in the first place and accounted for the later child outcome as well. Similarly, perhaps parents with high IQ behave in the ways identified as positive, and children with high IQ function better in terms of the outcome chosen, with parents and children sharing high IQ due to genetics. Without considering such interpretations, one cannot reach firm conclusions about the role of early experience. The case of Thomas from our ongoing study illustrates some of these problems. As mentioned earlier, Thomas experienced clearly malevolent care in infancy. This care was characterized by both harsh treatment and chronic emotional unavailability. In light of this history, the SE's inability to control his anger and other conduct problems he showed as a teenager are not surprising. However, Thomas also witnessed his father's violent suicide when he was 6 years old. His mother died of cancer when he was a teenager, and his life was completely unstable and stress-filled throughout childhood and adolescence. He was also chronically rejected by peers. Might not such experiences be equally responsible for any conduct problems Thomas showed as a teenager? Each case is, of course, even more complex than this. What if, as was true for Thomas, there were some adults who took a special interest in him, and he had an extensive period in treatment with a supportive therapist? Or what if, hypothetically, his primary caregiver had recovered from her drug dependency and other life problems, and formed a more stable social support network during the middle part of childhood? And what if, based on these changes, she then provided a more stable life situation for Thomas? We would expect child behavior to be positively influenced. What then becomes of the early negative experience? Does it still exert an influence? More to the point, in what ways or in what circumstances would we expect it to be manifest? In light of all of this, what role do we assign to early experience? No one can doubt that the family trauma and stress of his later juvenile years would also impact Thomas's development. Developmental psychologists also are in accord in the belief that experiences with peers, as well as with parents, shape developmental outcomes. Notice that the hypothesis is not that only early experience is important, or even that early experience is more important than later experience. Rather, the hypothesis is that early experience, because of its very place in the developmental course, has some special importance for the development of the person. An analogy of constructing a house may be helpful. We may think of early experience as the foundation for the building. The foundation cannot be more important than solid supporting beams or a sturdy roof. Without these, the house will not last. But at the same time, a house can. 10. Understanding development. Not be stronger than its foundation, and the foundation frames or structures what the house can become, though it does not specify many details. It is in this sense that the foundation of a house has special importance. There are, of course, limitations to the house metaphor. A develop ing person is not a concrete structure, but a dynamic, living system. One feature of the theoretical perspective we outline in Chapter 2 concerns the transformational nature of development. When early experience is integrated with later experience, it remains, in a sense, but in a transformed way, as suggested in our introductory quote, that is, later experience and later development can impact the influence of early experience. Development is not like building with Legos, with pieces simply added one on top of another. Development is a dynamic process wherein what evolves derives from what was there before in a logical way, while at the same time, prior experience or prior adaptation has a fundament. Tally new meaning in the now more complex system. Development is not linear, it is characterized by both continuity and change. What happens early on does not lead in a direct way to a similar-looking outcome later. There always is a complex, ongoing transact tie-in between the person, as developed to that point, and a changing array of challenges and opportunities, stresses, and supports. What developmentalists seek to describe is the coherence of this process, the way development is organized for the individual. Thus, examining the place of early experience is just the starting point. Such a dynamic, systemic view does not trivialize the role of early experience or early adaptation. Rather, it calls attention to the process of development, to questions about how early experience might exert an ongoing influence. To fully evaluate the place of early experience in development, one must go beyond simply showing a link between measures of early experience and later outcomes. A satisfactory evaluation involves also illustrating the processes and mechanisms through which any such linkages occur, including the ways in which early experience and adaptation combine with later experiences of diverse kinds. The challenge we faced as we began our research was to evaluate issues such as the role of early experience within an emerging perspective on the organization of development, with all of the complexity of continuity and change in the trajectories of individual lives. It was a daunting task, but we believed the answer lay in conducting a comprehensive, detailed, long-term study in which the host of potential influences were considered together over time, from the very beginning of development. In the end, we did show that early experience is of profound importance in the development of a child. The Challenge 11. Outline of the Minnesota Study. For more than 30 years, we have pursued questions concerning the nature of individual development. The first step was a short-term longitudinal study in which children were followed from infancy to kindergarten, for the purpose of initially validating proposed early measures. In a series of studies, we showed that measures of quality of care provided by principal caregivers predicted later security of the child, as well as self-confidence, curiosity, flexible self-control, and positive functioning with peers. Arendt, Gove, and Srauff, 1979, Mattis, Arendt, and Srauff, 1978, Srauff and Waters, 1977a. These findings, which were replicated in our current sample, Egeland and Farber, 1984, Erickson, Srauff, and Egeland, 1985, Srauff, 1983, were the background for our ongoing, large-scale, comprehensive longitudinal study. The study is characterized by 7 essential features. Children born into poverty. Assessments beginning before birth. Detailed age-by-age assessment. Comprehensive measures across domains. Study of normal and maladaptive development. Considerations of developmental context. Early assessments at the level of relationships. Each of these features is discussed in the following sections. Children of poverty. Deciding which children and the number of children to study were crucial decisions at the outset of this project. There are always trade-offs in deciding sample size. On the one hand, given the complexities of development and the number of questions that must be answered, a relatively large number of children is required. The need to statistically control for a sizable number of alternative explanations for any finding makes this essential. At the same time, if detailed, age-by-age measures are required, including labor-intensive direct observation of parents and children, a huge number of participants becomes impractical. Parent reports are valuable, and we used them extensively. However, relying exclusively on how parents say they treat their children and how parents, or children, say the child is now behaving is not completely adequate. Parents may say one thing and do another, have understandable biases in the way they view parenting, or simply have a different perspective than an partial observer. We believed strongly that direct observation was essential. 12. Understanding development. Tile, as were comprehensive assessments of all areas of functioning. Therefore, sample size had to be constrained. Ultimately, we followed 180 children from the last trimester of prenatal development to adulthood. We also evaluated smaller subsamples in great detail in our own preschool program and in a series of camps during middle childhood and adolescence. In part, these detailed observations allowed us to validate more global assessments made on the entire sample, as well as to examine intricate features of social behavior. Studying children of modest poverty was both a matter of conscience and a strategic choice. In the mid-1970s, when we began this project, relatively little research, and almost no research in which children were followed over time, had been carried out with children outside of the middle class. Gathering information about the lives of these children was worthwhile in its own right. At the same time, children born into poverty in Minneapolis at this time were expected to be at risk for developmental problems, but not at such severe risk as families living in poverty for generations. Poverty was not yet entrenched in this community. Thus, factors associated with poverty, single parenthood, low education, drug and alcohol abuse, were not so consistently part of the picture as they are in some poverty samples. We would expect that while a number of these children would develop problems, many would also do well. In the end, it was the case that about half the children we studied have developed well, which is remarkable given the challenges their families sometimes faced. About half had some notable problems. Some families encountered incredible stress and difficulty, and at times, clear maltreatment of the child occurred. At other times, family circumstances stabilized and supports improved. This range of family functioning allowed us to examine the role of early experience in two ways. First, by examining the entire range of parenting differences, and, second, by looking at the results of extremely negative care. While we would never wish any children to develop with problems, from a purely statistical point of view, the variation in our sample was ideal. We have enough variation in level of competence, and in the number and type of problems to answer the important questions we set out to answer. Moreover, we believe that such a sample allows us to generalize our findings to a large number of U.S. families. Beginning before birth. The transactional process of mutually influencing exchanges between organism and environment begins at conception. We believed that it was important to begin our assessments in the prenatal period, both because we wanted to understand the circumstances into which the child was. The challenge 13. Born, and because we wanted to study the developmental process from the beginning. This is especially important if one wants to examine the roles of parental attitudes and expectations, and any inherent child characteristics. Attitudes and expectations of parents clearly could be influenced by the behavior of the child they are rearing. Thus, we wanted to tap into such expectations before the child was born. Equally, manifest child characteristics likely are influenced by parental attitudes and expectations, and the parenting behavior they foster. Many past studies have begun after infancy, yet have drawn conclusions concerning the role of temperament. When temperament is taken as a descriptive concept, that is, simply as a characterization of the child's style of behavior, Whatever the causes, this is meaningful. Children certainly vary in terms of activity level, thresholds of responsiveness, and so forth. But when temperament is taken as an etiological concept, a reflection of endogenous child characteristics that lead to certain behavior, problems or competencies, this is inappropriate. The reason is that we cannot rule out the transforming role of parental influences in the period since birth, or the role of prenatal care. We cannot infer what the child was like as a young infant from his or her behavior as a preschooler. Likewise, as valuable as it may be, we cannot simply accept the report of the parent that he was always like that, or the parent's retrospective reports about how they did and did not treat the infant. These all must be directly observed. We began our measurements of infant temperament and parental care at birth. Especially if one is interested in the early experience hypothesis, there is no choice but to start at the beginning. We also chose to study first-time mothers, so that any expectations based on a previous child would not be in effect. Detailed observations, age by age. Guided by our interest in the early starting developmental process, we necessarily conducted very dense and detailed assessments in the early weeks, months, and years of life. As reported in Chapters 3 and 4 and in Appendix A, we carried out extensive prenatal interviews and testing of parents, and began collecting data on the infants at birth, beginning with nurses' ratings in the newborn nursery and continuing with home assessments at 7 and 10 days. We carried out 11 additional direct assessments between 3 months and 30 months, and 4 more prior to school entry. Assessments were then made almost yearly until age 13, with follow-ups at ages 16, 17 and a half, 19, 21, 23, 26, and 28. This pattern of assessment, with dense coverage of the early years, is important for at least 2 reasons. First, development is very rapid in the early months and years of life. 3-month-olds are qualitatively 14 understanding development different than newborns. 10-month-olds, with their capacities to recall previous experience and anticipate outcomes, are more like adults than they are like 3-month-olds. 3-year-olds, with their language and narrative memory abilities, are more like adults than they are like 10-month-olds. Dense assessments are required to track the development of individuals across these profound transitions. Second, given the rapid changes occurring, the only way to capture the transforming influence of parent on infant or infant on parent is to be there early and often. As one example, we found dramatic individual differences on the Bailey, 1969, scales of infant development, which we gave at both 9 and 24 months. Some children showed a 40-point decline in functioning across this age span. This change is a more important feature of development than either the starting or ending point alone. As we report in Chapter 5. This volume, such a decline was associated with a particular pattern of care. Comprehensive assessments. To evaluate adequately our developmental process view requires comprehensive assessment of all salient domains of experience, multiple domains of functioning, and a host of potentially mediating factors. One must, of course, measure not just parental care but influences of other family members beyond primary caregivers, as well as the influence of peers, teachers, and others outside the family. Similarly, one must measure and control for possible correlates of parenting, which themselves might be related to outcomes in question. We mentioned parent IQ and level of poverty earlier. Other personal characteristics of the parents, example, depression, and other aspects of the parent's circumstances, such as amount of life stress, see the section on context below, could influence parenting and through that, the child. They could also have a more direct impact on the child, for example, because of the child's direct experience of some of the same stresses. All of these features of development were assessed as part of our study. It was also necessary to assess characteristics of the child that could be directly related to some outcomes or could influence the developmental process through their impact on the parent. Prominent here were child motor and cognitive development, IQ, and temperament. IQ was an especially important consideration with regard to certain outcomes, such as performance in school. Temperament was important to study not only as a variable to control but also in conjunction with experience. Whether experience predicts outcomes above and beyond temperament would be only one question. Other questions were as follows. Do temperament and experience together predict certain outcomes more strongly? The challenge 15. Do they predict better to different outcomes, or do they perhaps represent different pathways to similar outcomes? We assessed temperament at multiple times through both direct observation and parental report. Correlated changes also had to be considered. The possibilities here are numerous, but one example will suffice, that of the child's language development. It is possible, for example, that certain parenting qualities influence both young children's sense of security and their language development. The resulting competence with peers, or success in school, in particular, may be due to the language skills of the child, and not due to the child's capacity to trust in relationships. The only way to know is to have assessed language development. Of course, if quality of care exerted its influence on development through its impact on language, or self-regulation ability, or through its support for adequate functioning with peers, then this would not really diminish its importance. But it would lead to a different understanding of the developmental process than if outcomes were mediated by early trust experiences, or by all of these. Such an understanding of the developmental process is the main goal. Measurement of child functioning across ages also was comprehensive, capturing both positive aspects of adaptation and problem behavior. We assessed motivational, emotional, and social aspects of behavior. Thus, at various ages, we assessed exploration, curiosity, flexibility, emotional regulation and self-esteem, as well as problem-solving attitude, sense of effectiveness, and enthusiasm for new activities. We measured how well the child got along with teachers and peers, and we measured school success and failure, behavioral and emotional problems, and, ultimately, diagnosable psychopathology. Finally, we sought to capture not just outward manifestations of the child's functioning but the child's interior world as well. If, for example, early experience is to have an enduring effect, it must somehow be internalized and carried forward. To some degree, this would involve basic patterns of emotional regulation, which we could capture through overt behavior. But it also should be reflected in children's basic expectations and beliefs about the social world and themselves in it. Bowlby, 1973, argued that the child abstracts core aspects of experience, and that such mentally represented abstractions then guide subsequent expectations and behavior. Including representational measures in our study was crucial, because we were not only interested in whether experience influences development, but also in how it does so. Such representations would, of course, become more sophisticated with development, so it was necessary to utilize different assessments age by age. Our measures included play, drawings, story completions, and other forms of narrative. Having these measures over time enabled us to examine the 16 understanding development. Play between changing experience and changing representation, as well as to see whether representation carried prior experience forward, Carlson, Srauff, and Egeland, 2004. Thus, our goal was to assess all salient aspects of the child's functioning in all pertinent settings, home, school, and peer group, as well as the myriad potential influences on development. Our assessments were aimed at different levels, made use of multiple methodologies, and drew upon multiple informants. We carried out direct behavioral observation, administered formal tests, and conducted interviews with teachers, parents, counselors, and the children themselves. As often as possible, we used converging measures at the same time. Complementary study of normal and maladaptive development. Our study is based in the discipline of developmental psychopathology. A central premise of this discipline is that the study of normative processes is informed by the study of individual differences, just as variations are informed by an understanding of normative processes. Example, Sacchetti and Cohen, 1995. The same developmental principles govern normal and abnormal alike. Therefore, while we had a keen interest in understanding the origins of child, adolescent, and adult problems, we began at each age by examining the variety of ways that children were developing well. This set the stage for describing adaptations that were non-functional, in the sense that they would likely compromise later development. In our view, all children at each age make the best adaptation possible in light of available personal resources, environmental resources, and the challenges they are facing. In some circumstances, not seeking close contact from a parent, or being highly demanding, can be the most final thing for a child to do in an effort to meet his or her immediate needs. Sometimes, staying clear of a parent is necessary. Other times, being demanding is the only way to get any attention. But if these become the core of established patterns, they may be maladaptive in the long run because of experiences they compromise at the time and reactions they garner from others later. Development in context. Adequately assessing the context surrounding our participating families was crucial for several reasons. First, examining development in context immediately puts to rest the issue of parental blame. Yes, children develop within the context of the care their parents and other caregivers. The challenge 17. Provide. But such parenting itself takes place in a broader context of challenges and support. As we report in several later chapters, we find that the stress and, conversely, the social support that parents encounter is related both to the quality of their parenting and to child outcomes. Likewise, assessments of the parents' own developmental histories, and other aspect of the context of their parenting, have notable predictive power. Thus, in addition to being not at all useful, blaming parents for child problems is dramatically oversimplified and begins an infinite regress back to the earliest human couple. Second, as alluded to earlier, the stresses and other surrounding circumstances, example, violent neighborhoods, substandard housing, and frequent moves, that impact on parents may also directly impact the child. As with temperament, we wanted not only to control for such variation but also to investigate how such factors, assessed age by age, combined with caregiving experience in predicting various outcomes. Finally, our central interest was in developmental process, not simply whether some experience or some pattern of behavior at an early point was related to some later outcome. We were interested in the changing pattern of adaptation as children progressed in development, and as prior experience and adaptation interacted with current child lengths and supports. We were just as interested in change as we were in continuity of individual development. Development. In our view, as we discuss in the next chapter, such change is a lawful reflection of changing circumstances. Stances. We have found repeatedly that as family stress and social support increase and decrease, or when level of parental depression changes, child functioning likewise worsens or improves. Example, Egeland, Kokosk, Gottesman, and Erickson, 1990. In the position we outline, early experience is important, but it alone does not determine child outcome. In accord with Bowlby, 1973, we believe that development is always a product of the history of the child and current circumstances. Since the circumstances facing children go beyond the purview of parents alone, so then does the responsibility for the child's well-being go beyond the family to the broader society. Early assessments at the level of relationships. We felt it was essential in the first years of life to cast our assessments at the level of children's primary relationships and the contexts around them. First, child behavior is notably unstable in the early weeks and months of life, and early child characteristics do not predict well to later outcomes. Once context is considered, Samroth and Chandler, 1975, Samaroff and Fees, 2000. Second, we were seeking to predict rather complex outcomes, including the later organization of attitudes, expectations. 18. Understanding development and behavior, which is called personality. While infant behavior is not at this level of complexity, the organized dyadic relationship is. Therefore, we thought assessments at the level of relationships would be more powerful predictors of outcome. Finally, parents are formed personality ties, and parenting attitudes and expectations are established. Thus, from a purely practical statistical standpoint, it would seem that may assures of parenting would have a better chance to predict child outcome. We discussed theoretical reasons for this position in Chapter 2. These, then, are some of the practical reasons for designing our study the way we did. In part, we did it this way because there was no other way to do it properly. We wanted to provide the most comprehensive study to date of the process of individual development. Therefore, we needed to study a large number of families over time, cataloging how parents treated their children, the ups and downs of their lives, influences from outside the family, salient characteristics of the children in multiple domains of functioning, and a range of outcome arenas in the subsequent years. We knew at the outset that development was complex, and our research has only further underscored this reality. Key claims and guide to the book. In this book, we claim to demonstrate important features of individual development. We conclude, among other things, 1. That nothing is more important in the development of the child than the care received, include ing that in the early years. 2. That individuals are always impacted by the entire history of cumulative experience, and even following periods of dramatic change, early experience is not erased. 3. That personal characteristics such as resilience and various forms of psychopathology are developmental constructions and not inherent, inborn characteristics. 4. That dichotomies such as parents or peers, temperament or experience, and past experience or current circumstances are almost always false. 5. That change, as well as continuity, in individual development is coherent and lawful. And 6. That ultimately, the individual person can only be understood within a model of continuing transactions between developing persons and the supports and challenges they are facing. It is noteworthy that some of these claims are diametrically opposed to those made authoritatively by other psychologists. We need, in particular, to say a few words about genetic interpretations. We claim that parenting, not just the genes that parents provide, is an important influence on children. In a widely publicized book, Judith Rich Harris, 1998, wrote that, on the contrary, peers and not parents are the major influence on development, and that any influence parents have is through the challenge 19. Genes that they pass on, and not through anything they do. Many psychologists attribute a powerful role to genes in explaining individual behavior, although there is recently a growing understanding that genes outweighs must be viewed in interaction with the environment. Example, Caspi et al., 2002, Suomi, 2002. As Gottesman and Hansen, in Press, have writ 10, questions of nature versus nurture are meaningless, and we must return to epigenesis, the way in which biology and experience work together throughout thick and thin. Genetic influences were not part of our study, although we did may assure temperament, which many attribute to genetic influences. We did not use a twin design, and we have no DNA data. How then can we conclude anything regarding the impact of care? As one reviewer of a draft of this book asked, in response to our finding that being a single parent is a strong predictor of attention problems in children, Chapter 12. How do we know that isn't a genetic effect? How do these mothers get to be single parents in the first place? It was implied that our correlation was due to some shared genetic traits between mother and child that were responsible for both the mother's unwed pregnancy and attention problems of the child, example, low IQ, impulsivity. We argue that becoming an unmarried parent is due to complex factors and is linked to attention problems because of the ways such overtaxed parents at times stimulate and lean on their children. Can such a claim be supported? We, of course, were not trying to prove that genes or other biological factors are unimportant. That would have been preposterous even in 1974, when we began. Indeed, much of our perspective was based in evolution and biology, especially our understanding of the kind of care children need. We were seeking merely to demonstrate that what children experience and their life circumstances are important. Our view of development, which is elaborated in Chapter 2, is in accord with Maud. Earn Biology, example of Goodwin, 1994. In this position, development is the result of the total field, that is, genes, immediately surrounding context, supporting circumstances, and prior individual history. There were many ways we were able to show that care and context are important parts of this field, parts that have been somewhat underemphasized in recent decades. We mentioned in the preceding section our finding that changes in parental depression or changes in stresses and supports that parents experience lead to changes in parenting and in child behavior. When single mothers form a stable partnership or experience declining stress, behavior problems of their children decline. Example Erickson et al., 1985. See chapters 7 and 12, this volume. With such data, any genetic influences are held constant. Furthermore, in many of our analyses of ties between experience and later behavior, we statistically controlled for variables such as IQ. 20. Understanding development and aspects of temperament, which are commonly argued to have genetic bases. Also, many of the constructs we measured were at the level of relationships, not individuals, such as the child's positive expectations concerning a particular partner. When we show, for example, that at ages 8 and 11, children's positive representations of parents or peers are related to early reliability of care, controlling for IQ, the case is fairly compelling. See Chapter 8. Finally, we at times made precise, theoretically specified predictions that would require post hoc gymnastics to explain genetically. For example, that parental rejection would lead to child dependency. See Chapter 7. Another claim we make is that early experience has lasting importance, even following changing circumstances. For example, forecasting those who recover following adversity. Chapter 11. Other psychologists have written that early experience may be of trivial importance if differ. End experiences occur later. Example Kagan, 1984, Lewis, 1998. Again, the question arises, why should the reader accept our conclusions rather than those of others? Accepting our claims should be based on the degree to which you are persuaded of the soundness of our approach and the adequacy of our measurements. Our conclusions regarding the roles of parents and peers, the distinctiveness of their implications for various outcomes, and their joint, interactive, and transactive influences hinge on how adequately we measured parent and peer experiences, and care fully controlled for other major relevant factors. Likewise, the validity of our claims regarding early experience depends on the adequacy of our measures of early experience, later experience, surrounding contexts, and outcomes. Our finding that school success and failure are hugely influenced by history of care should be accepted only to the degree that we have adequately measured and taken into account IQ, socioeconomic status, and other factors known to be related to school success. We trust that the distinctiveness of this book is not the uniqueness of our claims, some of which are widely held, but the strength of the evidence marshaled to support them. Therefore, in chapters 2 to 4, we overview the conceptual underpinnings of our work and the methods we employed. In part 2 of the book, chapters 5 to 10, we describe the emergence of the person, attained patterns of adaptation, and their origins and course age by age. We not only predict individual outcomes, but also account for changes in trajectories. Part 3 is devoted to development and psychopathology. Chapter 11 describes the developmental process, what we have learned about the interplay of experience, representation of experience, and surrounding circumstances over time. We account for the fate of early experience following change and the development of individual constructs such as resilience. In Chapter 12, we present a developmental model of psycho The Challenge 21. Pathology, and provide data on the development and course of disturbed patterns of behavior, including attention/hyperactivity problems, depression and anxiety, and conduct disturbance. Implications for assessment, classification, treatment of problems, and intervention follow in Chapter 13. Then, in a final chapter, we discuss current directions of our work and present very recent data on adult disturbance, adult relationships, and relationship representation, and continuity of parenting across generations, based on new studies of the children of our grown-up partici. Pants. Some readers, perhaps because they know our project well or have an interest in a particular age, may wish to skip forward, turning back to the methods chapters as needed. But we would urge most to read the book as written, to understand both our assumptions, Chapter 2, and our methods, Chapters 3 and 4, before delving into the findings. We have tried to be concise in writing these chapters and to make them valuable reading in their own right. Some readers also may wish to skip ahead to the more clinical chapters at the end. The book is written so that this is possible. But, again, we urge most readers to read first about the normal developmental process and individual variations in adaptation. Understanding basic patterns of adaptation and maladaptation at each phase of development is crucial for all clinical work. Our view of clinical problems springs from this. The story of development is a complex tale, and to tell it completely takes time, but it is also an endlessly fascinating tale every step of the way. 22. Understanding development. Understanding development, a perspective on development. Chapter 2. A perspective on development. What exists at one phase becomes transformed into something related to, but also different than, what existed earlier. Rieger, 1974. We began our longitudinal studies at a particularly interesting time in the history of psychology. It was a time when, from one widely held perspective, such an enterprise seemed unpromising, if not doomed to failure. From another perspective, however, it may have been a uniquely opportune moment. The 1960s and early 1970s marked the demise of a certain concept tie-in of personality and at least one view of development. Social learning theorists at the time were presenting empirical demonstrations that PEOPLE behaved differently in different situations, and even in similar situa-tie-ins at different times. As argued by Walter Mischel, 1968, 1973, and others, it was situations, not personality structures, that seemed to determine behavior. This work launched a debate about the relative importance of situations and persons that lasted for decades. For a time, it also called into question the very construct of personality itself. If people can not be counted on to behave in a consistent way across time and situa tie-ins, then is it even meaningful to talk about personality? More pertinent to our work, does it make sense to attempt to predict stable, individual differences from earlier points in life, if such differences in adult behavior are not meaningful in the first place? Work specifically centered in developmental psychology at this time. 23. Also was calling key constructs into question. Most noteworthy, a study that, ironically, was conducted in our own department, reported that infants' behavior with their mothers also varied from situation to situation and showed little stability across time. Masters and Wellman, 1974. Infants sometimes looked at and vocalized to their mothers a lot, or cried or hugged them a lot, at other times, or when observed on another day, they did not. Given this, was attachment a meaningful individual differences construct? Did it make any sense at all to try to predict later characteristics of children from assessments of the infant-caregiver relationship? These would seem to be two large problems for our study before we even began. We were proposing to predict individual differences in later life from experience and adaptation at earlier ages, including from relationships in infancy. Important longitudinal studies of the time also were discouraging about the predictability of individual behavior over time. A prominent Study of the Era, the Fels Longitudinal Study, Kagan and Moss, 1962, proved only very modest evidence for the stability of characteristics such as dependency or aggressiveness. Results were especially weak predicting from the first years of life forward. Viewing a study such as ours as foolhardy, or not workable in principle, was certainly understandable in light of these studies. Today, we know that all of this information can be interpreted in a vastly different way. It is not personality or attachment or continuity of individual behavior that is called into question by the empirical findings presented in these studies, but rather a particular view of personality and a particular kind of developmental continuity. Let us consider an example of infant behavior to illustrate the issues here. A mother carries her 12-month-old son into a playroom, sets him on the floor by a group of toys, and sits in a chair. The baby glances back at her, then plays quietly with the toys for 3 minutes. This ends the first episode. A stranger enters the room and also sits in a chair. The baby looks at her, then glances at his mother, then looks at her again. Then he plays again, vocalizing to his mother twice about a ball. While playing, the ball rolls by the stranger. He crawls to the ball near her feet, then looks up at the stranger. Then he turns and rapidly crawls to his mother, and stands up with one hand on her knee. From there, he turns and looks again at the stranger, who is smiling at him. He smiles back. Then he moves back to the toys and plays. In a bit, the stranger joins him in play, and he, with one glance to his mother, accepts her overtures. In the next episode, the mother leaves the room. He looks at the door and fusses briefly, but the stranger is able to attract him back to the toys. His play remains subdued, and he occasionally glances at the door. When his mother returns after 3 minutes, he scurries over to her with a 24 understanding development toy. She picks him up and carries him to the center of the room, then sits again. The stranger leaves. He now plays facing her, looking at her twice and smiling once. His mother leaves a second time. Now he is quite upset and crying. The stranger returns and is able to settle him somewhat, but after a bit, he starts fussing again. His mother returns. He crawls rapidly to her, puts his arms up, and she picks him up. He leans in with his arms around her neck. She pats his back. His fussing stops in a few seconds, and soon he is pointing to a toy. She puts him down and takes her chair. He watches her sit, then begins playing again. This is the kind of thing Masters and Wellman were coding for their 1974 paper, and if we examine behavior frequencies, we see the problem. First of all, many behaviors, smiling, vocalizing, are rare, so they are not likely stable. In fact, as described, the infant looks at the stranger more times than he looks at his mother in the beginning episodes, and he smiles at them equally often, once. This could suggest equal attachment to the stranger from a perspective that only frequencies of attachment behaviors matter. Second, the behaviors are not stable across the different episodes. The baby does not cry much until the mother leaves the second time. He is in bodily contact with her only briefly early on, then a fair amount in the last episode. Clearly, these attachment behaviors are not being uniformly expressed. On the other hand, the patterning of this infant's behavior is quite coherent when one considers when the baby acted, as well as what he did. That his proximity to his mother occurred precisely when he had become aroused at finding himself suddenly close to the stranger, or following stressful separations, makes sense. His looks to his mother when the stranger entered and when the stranger got down to play with him, now referred to as social referencing, source, Emd, Campos, and Klinert, 1985, would seem to serve as a source of reassurance. In fact, much of his behavior, including the changes in play, can be summarized as using his mother as a secure base for exploration. The behavior is not inconsistent, it is organized and meaningful. The behavior changes, but it does so in a coherent way in response to changes in stress. other infants would show different, but also coherent, patterns of behavior. In a key, early study, Everett Waters, 1978, demonstrated that, in fact, such patterns of attachment behaviors were stable over a 6-month period, even though frequencies of particular discrete behaviors were not. A 20-minute observation yielded stability in patterns, whereas Waters estimated that hundreds of hours of observation would have been required for comparable stability of discrete behavior frequencies. Thus, part of the resolution of the person-situation debate was methodological and part was conceptual. When enough data are aggregated, people in fact show some stability in their behavior, especially. A perspective on development 25. Over time in the same situations, but even across situations. One reason for instability in individual differences, therefore, was inadequate sampling of behavior, example Epstein, 1979. Even more important, however, from another conceptualization of personality, people change their behavior in characteristic ways in response to varying situational demands. Mischel allowed for this possibility, but argued that there were no data to support it in 1968. For the well-adapted person, there are times when constraint is called for, and other times when unrestrained exuberance is appropriate. Meaningful differences in personality concern variations in the extent to which and the way individuals adjust their behavior in terms of these demands. Example, Block and Block, 1980. Personality is not primarily reflected in stability of behavior, in the sense of exhibiting identical behavior at all times and in all circumstances, but in the core of behavior, that is, the way it is organized. As with the infant bee Javier described earlier, individuals both vary in their behavior and show coherence in behavior across situations. Such a position is now widely accepted, example Fleeson, 2001. Personality as unchanging behavior has perished, but not so for personality as the organization of attitudes, expectations, and behavior, Srauff, 1989. Likewise, early longitudinal studies did not discredit the continuity of functioning over time, but only a view of continuity as homotypic, that is, as frequencies of particular behavioral expressions being identical over time. Models of heterotypic continuity, changing forms or manifestations of an underlying construct, Kagan, 1971, were not re-ally tested by the early studies, nor was coherence of individual development examined. By coherence, we mean the way the organization of functioning at one age is forecast by prior organizations and leads in a logical way to later patterns of adaptation. Mischel, himself, in a later important study, showed continuity in a key self-control characteristic. From ages 5 to 12 by utilizing the concept of heterotypic continuity, Mischel, Shota, and Rodriguez, 1989. The early studies started in a logical place, and they contributed to the field by showing that existing models of developmental continuity were not adequate. If you want to predict aggression in children, you cannot do so by looking at aggressiveness in infants, when such a construct is not yet meaningful. It turns out that aggressiveness is highly predictable from early in life, but from patterns of organization in the infant caregiver system, not from isomorphic behaviors of infants. Likewise, characteristics such as social isolation, attention problems, and low self-esteem, or their positive counterparts, turn out to be predictable, but only within a complex model of development, emphasizing the level of organization. The static trait views of personality and linear views of development. 26. Understanding development. Presented earlier were consistent with the learning theories that rose to prominence in the 1950s and 1960s. These theories in their early forms attempted to explain all behavior either in terms of association and drive reduction, or as acquired bit by bit through reinforcement. These were powerful positions, and their lasting legacy is the idea that predicting AC tool behavior should be the final arbiter in psychological science. We are indebted to them. There is no question of the power of conditioning in the expression of behavior. However, classic learning theories lent themselves to very mechanistic views of behavior, with little room for emo tie-ins, goals, or self-organization. If behavior is derived from the consistency with which drives are gratified, then vital individual differences in behavior should vary dimensionally, being constantly manifest with a particular frequency or intensity. Similarly, from the classic operant viewpoint, if each separate behavior is acquired separately, bit by bit through reinforcement only, frequency of reinforcement is germane, and individual differences in behavior should be similarly linear. This position quickly was fitted to, even inspired, situational specificity, because discriminatively different situations would be linked to separate reinforcement contingencies. But there could be nothing here about the individual behaving predictably differently in one situation, given his or her behavior in another, that is, no internal organizing processes were postulated. These early learning views were not fully developmental positions. Of most note, little attention was paid to when in development something happened. Changes in the maturity of the organism or prior experiences were not considered as fundamental to the reaction to external contingencies. There was no evolving structure of personality that might lead to qualitatively new reactions. There was no idea of transformed meaning of prior experience based upon new development. Behavior was the simple accumulation of experience. Modern social learn. ING views have, of course, evolved considerably, with increased roles for cognition, emotion, and self-constructs, example Bandura, 1997. Conceptual and theoretical supports. Even as we began our study, 4 sets of resources were available to us. The first was a research strategy, evolved to study early disturbance and positive adaptation in a coordinated way. Second was a dynamic, non-linear perspective on behavior. The third resource was a set of unifying principles. Finally, there were serviceably formal theories of development that could guide creation of our own theoretical perspective. We briefly review each of these resources in turn. A perspective on development 27. Risk research. Risk research was a strategy originally formulated to shed light on the origins of schizophrenia, but it ultimately had a great range of application, example, Garmazi, 1975. Schizophrenia is rare, afflicting about 1 person out of every 100 in the general population, so studying childhood antecedents of this adult disorder prospectively would require a huge sample to net many target cases. By studying the offspring of schizophrenic mothers, one could increase the number of eventual cases to perhaps 4 or 5 per 100 for those raised in adoptive homes, thus achieve greater statistical power. At-risk children could be compared to non-risk children to seek clues to early markers of schizophrenia. Even more important, comparing at-risk children who do and do not ultimately develop the disorder, one could possibly discover protective factors, that is, resources that promote resilience in the face of risk. Ultimately, this could provide guidance for prevention and early intervention efforts. Quickly, this strategy was applied to other outcomes and to other risk factors. Poverty, for example, was a major risk factor not only for schizophrenia but also for other problems, dwarfing maternal disorder in its general predictive power, example Seymour, 2000. Child maltreatment and even early patterns of child maladaptation also could serve to define risk groups. A risk factor is anything that increments the probability of some negative outcome. This strategy therefore led to the broad study of risk and protective factors, vulnerability and resiliency, include our own study. Early risk research, however, was atheoretical. It provided no guidance from a developmental perspective regarding what to assess in childhood to track progress of the groups of children. At first, in fact, researchers primarily looked for similar disturbances in behavior that were ultimately shown by adults. Beyond this general strategy, we would need theoretical guidance. For example, several theorists, example Erikson, 1950/1963, Havighurst, 1948/1972, had proposed the idea of development as a series of changing issues that provided foci for adaptation at different ages. Given such a changing landscape for adaptation, continuity would be reflected in qualitative similarity in the way issues were negotiated across ages, inferred from patterning of behavior. Our task was to spell out such issues age by age in a comprehensive manner, based on a coherent theoretical perspective. The dynamic systems approach. Dynamic systems perspectives provide an alternative to seeing the causes of behavior or development as simply inherent in the organism, as being. 28. Understanding development. Stamped in by the environment, or as a linear consequence of some initial cause. Gottlieb, 1971, Gottlieb, Gilbert, and Halpern, 2002, Sameroff, 2000, Sander, 1962, 1975, Steckler and Carpenter, 1967, von Bertalanffy, 1952, Weiss, 1949. In general terms, systems imply the mutual definition and interdependence of parts and wholes. Dynamic, living systems consist of mutually influencing constituents interacting over time. Only in functioning does the whole, or a part, have meaning. Such relationships between constituents and the whole tend to be maintained even as parts, and the whole, change. In terms of human relationship systems, this is what AC counts for continuity across generations, Srauff and Fleeson, 1986. Moreover, any biological system includes not only the parts of the organism but also both organism and environment. In systems viewpoints, new, non-obvious forms of increasing complexity emerge from the coactions of X.
Gold.
Isting parts and or in the face of new environmental demands. Gottlieb, 1971, Gottlieb et al., 2002. Concepts such as internally generated aims or goals are needed to understand a self-organizing, intact biological system existing and developing in constant interaction with a changing environment. Steckler and Carpenter, 1967, page 167. Early experience or early adaptation is important in systems perspectives as an initiating condition, setting the stage for subsequent transactions and providing base forms of organization. At the same time, systems theories are nonlinear in the sense that outcomes depend not only on initiating conditions but also their complex interactions with subsequent conditions. Sameroff and Chandler, 1975, provided an important framework for our research, which they called a transactional model. A key premise of this position concerns the ongoing, dynamic interchanges between person and environment. The impact of any early condition depends on the environment encountered and responses to. Later conditions depend on prior history. Premature but healthy new. Borns go on to have problems only in impoverished environments, not in advantaged environments. The impact of particular patterns of parental socialization depend on the prior history of the caregiver, infant relationship, example Belsky and Farron, 2002, Kochanska, Axon, Nock, and Rhines, 2004. This has been a critical aspect of our thinking. Again, useful as they were, systems perspectives provided no precise theoretical guidance. They pointed to neither critical initiating conditions nor to crucial aspects of the environment that must be considered. However, they did entail certain principles that would help us select the background theories for our work. 3 guiding principles. Our work is guided by the idea that certain principles characterize the development of all living systems, from plant life to the human brain, to a perspective on development 29. The development of the person, Edelman, 1992, Goodwin, 1994, Shore, 1994, Waldrop, 1992. The first such principle concerns the unity of development, the idea that the organism develops as a whole, Fogel, 1993, Thalen, 1989. As Qua, 1967, put it, in any given response of the animal to its environment, internal or external, and at any given stage of development, the whole organism is involved, page 92. For us, the unit of study is the whole person. It is the person that is adapting, and the patterns of adaptation we seek to assess are at the level of the person. We may examine aspects of cognition or emotion, or social behavior, but we do this always with an eye on overall adaptation. Cognition, emotion, and social behavior develop in an integrative, mutually influential way. The second principle is that development is characterized by emergency ing complexity or self-organization. New, more complex behavior emerges from what was present previously, and new structures show emergent properties not specified in the constituent parts. Development of the fetus can serve as an illustration of emerging complexity and as a basic model for all development. At first, there is simple cell division, a quantitative process with an increase in number of cells but little increase in complexity. Then, there is a series of qualitative transformations wherein an initial structuralization into layers of cells, ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm, leads to interconnected structures and systems, which then begin to function. Sroufe, 1996, page 39. The changes in organized complexity are sufficiently dramatic that different names are used to label the organism at different phases: zygote, blastocyst, embryo, fetus, yet these changes are not specified in the initial cells themselves or in the early structures. Rather, it is the coactions of the cells, and later coactions of evolving systems, in their environment that lead to emerging complexity. Goodwin, 1994. The developing brain provides another example. Sacchetti. 2002, Sacchetti and Cannon, 1999, Nelson, 2002, Siegel, 1999. As with the fetus, the brain does not develop by simply adding neurons one by one. Rather, it entails a process of increasing organization and complex ity. In the beginning, there is overproduction of neurons. Subsequent development involves both pruning and interconnecting of neurons into systems, then systems of systems. The migration of cells to their ultimate locations and their interconnections with other cells are again determined by coactions among the constituent units. For the fetus and the brain, and, we would argue, for the human personality as well, development is characterized by differentiation. This is our third principle. At first, there is a mass of undifferentiated units, exampled cells that are virtually all the same. Then, these form general structures. Later, these structures become more refined and specialized as they are organized into systems. It is this process of differentiation that 30. Understanding development makes early phases so important. Refinements can only operate on previously existing structures. Thus, early fetal damage or early brain damage has profound effects. Massive structural damage can result. Even a relatively small insult early on can be powerful. The same principles of integration, self-organization, and differentiation govern abnormal development, as well as normal development. Dante Sacchetti, Personal Communication, 2001, has described the working of these principles with regard to abnormal brain development. Abnormal brain development would be a self-organizing phenomenon. Perturbations that take place in the developing brain can trigger the cascade of growth and formation changes that could lead neural systems down a path that would deviate from that usually taken in normal neurobiological development. Abnormal perturbations at one stage of brain development could impair the construction of some new structures and functions, distort the form of later emerging ones, perhaps enable the construction of ones that would normally not emerge, and or limit the elaboration and usage of previously emerged structures and functions. And then abnormal spontaneous or initiated neural activity could trigger the formation of a wide range of structural and functional misorganizations, even in sites distant from the point of the actual abnormal perturbation. Such early developmental abnormalities may lead to the development of aberrant neural circuitry and often compound themselves into relatively enduring forms of pathology. We believe that these considerations that apply to the development of the body and the brain apply to the human personality. Because of emergent complexity and the phenomenon of differentiation, early distortions may have profound, far-reaching implications, even though they cannot be said to specify or by themselves directly cause later forms. Developmental theories. A number of developmental theories available in the 1970s were either based upon developmental systems thinking or at least were congruent with it. One theory that was very influential in our thinking was that of Heinz Werner, 1948. He argued that the development of biological forms is expressed by an increasing differentiation and an increasing subordination or hierarchization of parts. Hierarchization means that for any organic structure the organization of the differentiated parts is a closed totality, an ordering and grouping of parts in terms of the whole organism. Page 41, emphasis added. This is a structural theory, contain ing the nonlinear idea that an acquired capacity is retained, yet changes its meaning when new capacities are acquired and organized with it into. A perspective on development. 31. A more complex whole. In terms of personality formation, this would mean that early malevolent experience is not erased, but its meaning may change in light of subsequent development. Development is characterized by increasing complexity of organization, not simply quantitative additions. This would be central to what we would mean by a developmental position. Piaget's 1952 theory, which became prominent in the United States with the publication of Flavel's book in 1963, also was important to us. Most notable were his ideas regarding the child's active role in development and the idea of qualitative change. For Piaget, the child actively engages the surround, seeking mastery and nurturing its mind through this engagement. These efforts use all the tools the child has at hand, and as the tools change, so does the child's functioning in a fundamental way. The child understands the world, and therefore experiences it in fundamentally different ways at different ages, especially between infancy and later childhood. One reason that infancy may have special importance is because it is not subject to verbal recall and analysis. Piaget's process of equilibration also provided a serviceable explanation of developmental change, based upon a clash between existing structures and new goals or unassimilable demands from the environment. Vygotsky's 1962-1978 theory also directly influenced us. His The Ori represents a set of ideas about the integration of emotion and cognition, and the importance of context in development that were just beginning to become prominent in the 1970s, example of Bronfenbrenner, 1979. They certainly were part of our thinking from the beginning, Srauff, Waters, and Mattis, 1974. We were especially compelled by two of Vygotsky's ideas. One, that many experiences and capacities are first tiered within social relationships and only later are capacities of the individual, and, two, that rather than the environment stamping experiences into the child appropriates that which is provided in the surround. Rogoff, 1990. A closely related idea espoused by Louis Sander, 1962-1975, was explicitly part of our thinking. This was the notion that in the organization of the caregiver, infant system was the foundation for the organization that would become the personality. First, there is relationship. The emergent self-organization is a reflection of that prior organization. Finally, we mention here the genetic field theory of René Spitz, Emd, and Metcalfe, 1970. Spitz was popular in very few circles when we began our study and has only recently achieved acclaim in light of new studies of institution-reared infants. Spitz had observed infants in orphanages in the 1940s and 1950s, concluding that their failure to thrive was due to a lack of loving care. Spitz's research was not tightly 32. Understanding development controlled, leaving open the possibility that some factor other than lack of maternal love, example, sensory deprivation, was the culprit, and that the rampant infections and deaths in these settings were not consequences of infant despondency but were causes. Recent, controlled research makes clear that he was much more right than wrong, example Gunnar, 2001, and bolsters two of his concepts that strongly influenced us. The first is the idea of sensitive period, embraced by numerous students of animal behavior and by researchers of language development, example, Lenneberg, 1967. Briefly, this refers to a special openness to, or requirement for, certain kinds of experience during a particular developmental period. Point 1. Thus, the child may be less responsive to, or responsive in a different way to, the same stimulation occurring at another time. For example, it is difficult to acquire language unless the child is exposed to language in the first years of life. Of more interest to Spitz, if infants are deprived of responsive care, the capacity for human attachments may be compromised in a fundamental way. This notion is supported by the outpouring of information on brain development, in which neural developments have been found to be curtailed unless certain stimulation is present at particular times. Nelson, 2002, Shore, 1994, Siegel, 1999. The second concept of Spitz that influenced us was the developmental prototype, Spitz et al., 1970. This is a seminal idea. A developmental prototype is a root form, the progenitor of later forms, but related to them in a complex, nonlinear way. In keeping with other organization theories, such as Werner's, the later form emerges from the prototype, is inspired by it, and embodies it in its core, but it is by no means a replica. The new form is a transformation of the prototype. For example, the newborn smile is the prototype for the later social smile, but not because it is identical in form, cause, or function. Srauff, 1996. The newborn smile involves no mouth opening, no crinkling of the eyes, nor is it based on cognitive mastery or recognition, and it is not part of a social exchange. This smile, which occurs almost solely during sleep, reflects the rising and falling of central nervous system, CNS, excitation, occurring either randomly or in response to physical stimulation. It is the prototype for the later social smile because of the arousal modulation core common to both. But arousal modulation in the 3-month-old is due to particular meanings resulting from cognitive processes, often occurring in social encounters. The latter develops from the former in a logical, describable process and embodies the initial core, but it has a fundament. A perspective on development. 33. 1. Sensitive period is preferred over the term critical period, which Spitz used, because it does not imply the impossibility of corrective experience or a very narrow age span of influence. Tally different place in the functioning of the infant. We believe that developmental prototypes apply to broader constructs such as personality as well. We also believe they apply to individuals, as well as normatively, and that early individual adaptations are well viewed as prototypes in this sense. They will be reflected in core features of later patterns of adaptation, however much more complex these may be. Freud's psychoanalytic theory. Properly situating Freudian theory in the background of our work is complicated. Freud was the original author of several hypotheses we were to test in our research, including the idea that early experience has special significance, that the emotional life of infants is of great importance, and that early primary relationships are central in the shaping of personality. Freud, 1940–1964, even put forward the prototype hypothesis, that the early primary relationship was the prototype for all subsequent relationships. Given this, one might have expected close connections between our work and Freud's theory. On the other hand, classic Freudian theory was a drive reduction theory, with quantitative and linear predictions concerning development. As did George Klein, 1976, we distinguished between Freud's clinical observations and the drive-based explanations he evolved for them. For example, infants do develop special connections with caregivers, but not through secondary drive reduction in association with feeding. The conceptual problems of the fixed energy, hydraulic, drive reduction model were notable and thoroughly discredited, to some extent even by Freud in his later writing, Levinger, 1976. If the master motive was to keep tension low, why would animals learn complicated behaviors simply for the reward of looking through a window? Butler, 1953. and why would children in their play, and adults in their actions, seek to reenact conflicts or repeat challenging events? If attachment to mother was based on oral gratification, why would Harlow's 1966 monkeys spend their time with the cloth surrogate that did not feed them and run to it when frightened, rather than to the wire mother equipped with a botley? A theory based solely on drive reduction would never be adequate. There are, of course, other aspects of psychoanalytic theory in which mastery and meaning are emphasized rather than drive reduction. Brieger, 1974, Freud, 1926. To us, it seemed entirely possible to retain certain core ideas of psychoanalytic theory while discarding the mechanistic drive concepts. We followed the lead of a long line of scholars, example Erikson, 1950-1963, in 1. Broadening Freud's psychosexual issues, oral, anal, etc., to psychosocial issues, trust, autonomy, and control. 2. Replacing mechanistic concepts such as fixation and regression with 34. Understanding development. Developmental concepts such as prototype and hierarchical organization, and 3. Replacing the pleasure principle, keep tension low, with strive ing for mastery and coherence as the larger goals guiding behavior. Brieger, 1974. Central roles for emotion, early experience, and vital social relationships need not be wedded to drive reduction mechanisms. Srauff, 1996. This broader, evolved psychoanalytic theory really had not been tested and was compatible with the other developmental theories discussed earlier. Bowlby-Ainsworth attachment theory. Bowlby's theory became prominent just before we began our work and was the most direct inspiration for our long-term study. Example Bowlby, 1969-1982. While initially rejected by many in the psychoanalytic community, Bowlby's theory is psychoanalytic in terms of the core features just described. However, rather than being couched in 19th century physics, as were Freud's ideas, Bowlby's ideas sprang from evolutionary theory, ethology, and biological systems theory. He and Ainsworth, 1969, both specifically eschewed drive reduction concepts in explaining attachment. Infants are attached to caregivers because caregivers have been interactively present in an ongoing way. That is all that is required. The disposition to organize behavior with regard to the goal of proximity to a caregiver, as well as the caregiver's inclination to be responsive to these bids, was selected through evolution. Since humans remain relatively helpless for many months, being protected by caregivers was essential for survival. Thus, infants engage in attachment-serving behaviors because they develop the capacity to do so and are biologically disposed to do so. Just as a bird will build a nest until it is complete, or continually start over if an experimenter dissembles it, in conditions of threat, humans will direct an array of behaviors to a caregiver until proximity is achieved. No special attachment drive need be postulated. Behavior is goal-directed, not driven, and not conditioned in a simple way. Many behaviors can serve the attachment system, and no behavior is exclusively an attachment behavior. If one behavior fails in the aim of achieving proximity, the infant calls, but the caregiver does not come, another may be used, the infant raises its arms. Likewise, with development, as new behaviors become available, the infant shows increasing flexibility, readily replacing less differentiated reactions, crawl ing to the caregiver versus simply crying when aroused at an earlier age. Before we began our study, Ainsworth had already shown that when mothers promptly picked up and comforted crying infants, they cried less by the end of the first year. Ainsworth, Bell, and Staton, 1974. They had not been conditioned to be crybabies. They had learned about a perspective on development. 35. The effectiveness of signals and could now substitute more flexible signals as they became available. In the Bowlby-Ainsworth system, the learning that takes place is a broader learning, a learning about organized ing behavior with respect to the caregiver. Srauff and Waters, 1977a. The Bowlby-Ainsworth theory is truly developmental. In keeping with other dynamic systems positions, it has as a central premise ongo-ing transactions between evolving organism and surround. The pathway chosen turns at each and every stage of the journey on an interact tie-in between the organism as it has developed up to that moment and the environment in which it then finds itself. Bowlby, 1973, page 412. Since the child adapts actively, and the personality is more formed and more complex at each point, individuals are increasingly forces in their own development. This is another key developmental premise. From Waddington, 1957, Bowlby borrowed the concept of homeoresis. The increasing tendency for chosen pathways to be stable as develop. Ment proceeds. From Piaget, Bowlby explicitly took the idea that the child is open to different kinds of experience and capable of different kinds of understanding at different ages. For example, it is beyond the capacity of the young child to understand that two parental statements or a statement and an action may be contradictory, with at least one being therefore subject to explicit rejection. Explicit verbal statements, "I'm doing this for your own good," must be accepted. Therefore, there are at least two reasons that early emotional experience has a special place in this theory. First, the initial adaptations set the direction for later development and color encounters with later experiences. Second, infants have a qualitatively different, pre-verbal, way of encoding experience. Early experience may be carried forward with little alteration precisely because it cannot be verbally analyzed. This is similar to Freud's idea of the dynamic unconscious, but within a modern cognitive framework. Research during the last 2 decades has made it clear that there is not only an early emerging procedural memory system, but that this system also has a different neural base than the later emerging verbal, semantic, memory system. Example Nelson, 2000. The child is not viewed as fixated at an early stage, but is guided in subsequent encounters by what Bowlby, 1973, refers to as working models. These are abstractions of direct experiences with caregivers, and they guide future expectations the way all generalizations do, although early models are outside of verbal awareness. Unlike fantasies emphasized by some other psychoanalytic theorists, these models are viewed as tolerably accurate reflections of the experiences those individuals have actually had. Page 407. If caregivers have been consistently responsive, then infants evolve expectations that caregivers, and, by generalization, others, will be so in the future. At the same time, in a calm. 36. Understanding development. Plementary way, the infant evolves a model of the self as worthy of care and as effective in eliciting it. Such preverbally established expectations, or their converse, have a powerful influence on later social encounters. An unwanted child is likely not only to feel unwanted by his parents, but to believe he is essentially unwantable, namely unwanted by anyone. Page 238. Again, these ideas are well supported by contemporary research on scripts, narrative construction, affective memory, and other advances in cognitive science. Belsky, Spritz, and Kernick, 1996, Bretherton and Mulholland, 1999, Nelson, 1999, Nelson and Gruendel, 1979, Waters, Rodriguez, and Ridgway, 1998. As a structural dynamic theory of successive adaptations, the Bowlby-Ainsworth theory is developmental in the sense of making important nonlinear, non-obvious predictions. One clear example concerns the growth of self-reliance or independence in the preschool years. In contrast to all other theories of the time, infants who were effectively dependent, that is, who directly signaled their caregivers when threatened, and who elicited consistent responsiveness, were predicted to be more self-reliant as preschoolers. This is because, in having their security needs met through responsive care, they acquired a sense of themselves as effective and capable. Infants who do not experience responsiveness, including those pushed toward precocious independence, will later show dependency problems. As presented later, we obtained complete confirmation of this hypothesis in our work. Finally, Bowlby's theory is a suitable framework for developmental psychopathology research such as ours. As were we, Bowlby was interested in explaining both normal and disturbed development. In contrast to Freud, however, and more in keeping with the now established principles of developmental psychopathology, Sacchetti and Cohen, 1995, Rutter and Srauff, 2000, Srauff, 1986, Srauff and Rutter, 1984, Bowlby began by seeking an understanding of normal development. Beginning with the study of normal development led Bowlby to a very different view of emotions than that of Freud. Emotions such as fear, anxiety, and anger are normal reactions to naturally occurring circumstances and can guide individuals in maintaining vital relationships. Disturbance, therefore, is seen both when such reactions are chronic, misdirected, or inappropriately triggered, and when they fail to happen when needed. For example, failure to grieve following a significant loss is pathogenic. In general, much disturbance is the result of failures by significant adults to respond appropriately to the young child's normal needs for closeness to caregivers and fears of separation in threatening situations, or by direct or implicit threats of abandonment made by caregivers. Most forms of psychopathology entail either problems of emotional dysregulation or distorted personal relationships. Cole, Michel, and O'Connell Teddy, 1994. A Perspective on Development, 37. Srauff, Dugull, Weinfeld, and Carlson, 2000. According to Bowlby, the root of such problems is often caregivers' failure to help the young child regulate normal emotional reactions, or even to contribute to their dysregulation, and being untrustworthy as the child's primary relational partner. Synthesis, an organizational perspective on development. We have integrated the various conceptual and theoretical ideas discussed earlier into what we refer to as an organizational perspective on development. Srauff, 1979, Srauff and Waters, 1977a, Srauff et al., 1974. This was the guiding framework for our research. The first premise of this perspective is that the fundamental feature of behavior is organization. Recall from our example of the infant in the playroom, page 24, that it is the patterning of behavior that was critical. It is not the mere occurrence of a behavior alone, or even its intensity, that reveals its meaning, but its organization, with other behaviors, with regard to social partners, and with other aspects of context. Consider another example. A 12-month-old is playing with toys in an unfamiliar playroom, with her mother seated behind her several feet away. After examining several items in succession, she comes upon a toy elephant. She briefly puts it aside, then looks at it again with rapt attention. Tie-in. Then, with widened eyes, she picks it up and, in a smooth move, turns and shows it to her mother, smiling broadly and vocalizing. Were this remarkable reaction described merely as child smiles or child shows toy to mother, the richness and meaning present would be missed. The integration of the show, the broad smile, and the vocaliza tie-in has vastly different meaning than any of the behaviors individually. Infants virtually never show such organized, effective sharing with a stranger, though they do frequently look at them, smile at them, or show them toys. Waters, Whitman, and Srauff, 1979. The organized sequence of behavior also reveals the emotional meaning. The child recognizes the object, imbues it with meaning, then directly, automatically shares her delight. Clearly, her caregiver is tied together with such experiences of joy. This is distinct from affiliative gestures to strangers, which are not organized in the same way with respect to exploration of the object world. A second premise of the organizational perspective is that organiza tie-in is revealed in the interplay of emotion, cognition, and social behavior. Consider, for example, a preschooler, a.k., running with companions. 38. Understanding development. Down to a sand-filled play area. On spotting a wooden structure in the center of the area, a.k. shouts gleefully, "Hey, it's a boat," and flops onto the sand and swims over to the structure. The others follow, with laughter and shouting all around. Notice what is involved here. There are cognitive features, as in seeing the analogy between a boat in water and the wooden structure, which was not literally boat-like, in the mid-lee of the sand. There are affective elements, as in AK's delight and enthusiasm. And there is the communication and other aspects of social sharing. But what is most revealing is how they all work together. The others follow not only because AK asks them to, but also because of the cleverness of the idea and the contagious emotion. AK's competence is revealed by this organization, and our assessments were based on this proposition. A third premise is the key proposition. Development is defined by changes in organization of behavior over time, Srauf, 1996. Consider a comparison of a 6-month-old and a 10-month-old playing the cloth in mouth game with their fathers. The parent puts the cloth in his mouth, then moves it back and forth by shaking his head. This will capture the 6-month-old's attention. She stops, stares, then methodically reaches for the cloth, pulling it free. She likely will then put it in her own mouth. At 10 months, reaction to this situation is dramatically different. The infant stops, looks, perhaps glances back and forth between cloth and father's face, then, smiling broadly, tugs the cloth free. Then, calm